Had enough of the been there, done that ideas? Tired of too much talk and so little action? Rewind now and welcome to Transformation and Change Radio with Dr. Kathy Obear, where the vision of true equity, inclusion, courage, and purpose meet powerfully. Dr. Kathy delivers with dynamic, engaging conversation and the most authentically brave dialogue on air today. This hit show will challenge you to explore current issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion and deepen your capacity to choose courage to speak up to greater inclusion in everything you do. Fasten your seatbelts and accelerate your effectiveness to become a powerful change agent in your life, community, job, and society. Imagine true equity and inclusion and get the tools to really manifest your vision. No frills, no fluff, just really powerful, good stuff. Transformation and Change Radio starts now.
Listeners, I couldn't be more excited about this conversation around self-care and community care, a critical conversation about retention strategies with Dr. Amoaba Gooden. Thank you for coming back.
Oh, you're so welcome. Happy to be here.
Oh, I'll talk about the book, I'm sure, a few times, and y'all can get this free on the website for the radio show as well as on my website, drkathyobear.com. But Amoaba, I was rereading it a bit this morning, and the warning signs of burnout were just jumping out at me. And I wrote this 6 years ago. And to realize that I don't think I talked about systemic change and the culture and climate. So we may do some personal conversations around self-care, community care, how we take care of ourselves. And listeners, we're going to also add something I want to learn more about from Dr. Gooden, which is, what are the systemic dynamics, policies, practices we can shift that will then change the culture and the climate? What can you do as a supervisor or leader with your team? If you've all been coming the last couple of months, this will be the third time you've been with me and Dr. Gooden, and so you know it's going to be a conversation. For those that are new to Dr. Amoaba Gooden, Vice President for the Division of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion at Kent State University, and you'd previously served as the chair of the Department of Pan-African Studies for 9 years, I believe, much less your time in the University of Guelph in Toronto and other places where you did your different research and multiple degrees, which might be part of contributing to lack of self-care for folks in multiple marginalized identities, having to have multiple degrees before we white people see you as credible, even close to as good as we are. Everybody breathe. We're bringing in whiteness and white culture early. I must have had some coffee. So what I'm particularly excited about, in your, there's so many things, but in your bio, you say you use higher education as a pathway for others to drive community mobilization and change for folks, particularly in marginalized identities, and that your research and teaching interest is not only migration, given your multiple identities as born in Jamaica, now citizen of Canada, now in the US, on migration identity, barriers to health and health promotion. And those last two, I see so connected, barriers to health and health promotion. And so I thought we might start in a moment as you share, but I thought we'd first start with some breathing, since we're talking about self-care, community care, and reclaiming our space and ourselves and our identity, even in toxic, difficult moments and organizations. Listeners, why don't we just breathe a moment? Just as you're able, find your feet on the floor, seat in the chair. My neck is saying to roll and stretch. Oh, let's take 3 slow, deep breaths in, hold, and out all the way, whatever that means for your body. And they say in through the nose as useful as you're able, expanding your rib cage as you're able, or your belly, and slowly out. Because when we focus on breathing, we're not listening to the obsessive thoughts in our brains. Breathe and out. Whew. Thank you for that. I needed it. However you would like to say hello as you introduce yourself and have people get grounded in who you are. But I was particularly curious about growing up, maybe the messages we both had that helped us have self-care, community care, wellness, and maybe ones that set us up to be on the path to passion fatigue and burnout.
Thank you, Dr. Obear, Kathy. Thank you for the invite, and thank you for just these conversations over the last couple of months. I've really enjoyed them.
Me too.
Your breathing exercise just reminded me of that we've got to take every opportunity to take care of ourselves and enter every interaction, every conversation, every space, and centering the care of ourselves. So thank you for that. So your question, I'm going to invoke my grandmother. You know, your question kind of really reminded me of the lessons she taught me. As most of the listeners might know, I was born in Jamaica, and I spent a couple of years with both of my grandparents on my paternal and maternal. But it was my paternal grandmother in particular for me. I would just remember her centering care. So we started every morning with a cup of hot tea, and we ended every night with a cup of hot tea. And depending on the season, so if it was mango season, you know, high sugar, we would have a detox tea, right? To do a little bit of cleanse. And so the ritual around self-care was seasonal. As well as it was just a regular practice. For her, having a good meal and good food was really centered around a care. So she prepared and cooked her meal every morning and every night. Again, ending with tea, using herbs if we were sick, and sleep was paramount. When it got dark, when it was at a particular time, it was just time to stop what we were doing, stop playing, wash up, and go to bed. So good food, care, and then using herbs as a way to kind of care for our physical bodies was really paramount for her. She was a spiritual woman. And so Sundays were moments of community, not just a formal church, but to be in community with other people in the neighborhood around whether it's singing or laughter, but really centering the divine in her relationship with others. So I'm just so thankful of that, the opportunity to just invoke her, you know, at this moment. I needed that.
I'm so struck as a white person born, raised US, that was so different. And so my first wonder was how not only there's such a culture shock moving to Canada, but then the Canadian culture, how much of that was whiteness culture, kind of European. We're both so Anglo and French colonized areas.
Yeah. So it's interesting because on migration, I did all of my, most of my formal education in Canada. And I remember in this particular year, grade 3, just being very aware that the measurement of who I was really about my performance in the classroom. The value of other things that I brought to the classroom, my accent, my skin tone, my gender was of no value. It was just at that moment, at what level can you read? And that was really the measure of success, right? A performance-based measure of success. And I remember in the classroom, just other immigrant children experiencing the same thing that I did, right? Being devalued for the accents or the food that we ate, for example. So I do, and when I think about self-care, right, you then kind of measure yourself against whiteness and what I need to do to perform so that I could be cared for by the teacher, for example, or they would see me in a different light. So certainly I know I've internalized some of those notions of being around my own success, around performance, around, what we call excellence.
And even the ways of being, the cultural ways of being you grew up with would have been so valuable in Canada, the US, Kent State, my personal life. And yet how often the folks like me who have absorbed whiteness in the way of performing is the only way to show that you're smart and succeed and be valued and value others. And yet there's so many ways of being that would help us truly have retention, good quality working environments, inclusion, equity, good performance, not work addicted performance, which I did for decades, but really valuable team efforts.
Yeah. And then, as I'm talking, I'm thinking about the extension of that, even into how we then interact with healthcare professionals, right? So it became a movement from herbal teas, right, to medicine, right, synthetic drugs. And so it really kind of permeates and impacts all aspects of your life as we think about it. Yeah. And how we then think about self-care, right?
Wow. I didn't grow up, I don't think I knew the words. My dad was working all the time, even on our vacations, as I think I literally just came back from my wife had a golfing buddy vacation, and I worked 3 of the 5 days we were there. Had, some time in the sun, but even last week I was not practicing the level of self-care. It was mostly, though, my mom. I don't remember her being sick, but one day, morning till night, working, preparing food, taking care of us. She had 4 children. She did, Girl Scout leader, a neighborhood newsletter, very outgoing, vivacious. So I think she got energy from some of that. And we did chores, as I'm sure you did. And so inside chores, outside chores, homework. And so it was performing, getting straight A's, as well as being useful and helpful. And I don't know if you relate as a woman, because you have different identities somewhat from me, but the white woman part of always having to take care of others, put them first, serve men, babysat my younger brother, I'm not as important. And so all those sexist messages also came into play for me around my value, including
Definitely. And as you were talking, I'm very mindful of my mother. So I'll invoke her now. And I remember my mother who worked in Canada at what we would call piecework. So you get paid for the pieces of garments that you would put together on a piece of clothing. And you got paid by the amount, right, that you made every day. So I remember her being sick and really should not have gone to work, but really needed the money. And so I remember her going to work that particular day, but not making as many pieces as the supervisor had wanted her to make. And that, clearly impacted her pay. But she came home really upset and talking about that. And her really kind of reinforcing for us not what we want to do, but she wanted us to be successful and to graduate so that we didn't have to do what she was doing. We didn't have to rely on, or working in a factory, for example, for our success. And so that impacted, I think, all 3 of us in terms of how we think about work and sometimes putting aside our self-care for whatever definition of success we have at that moment.
You're really calling in kind of a European US whiteness capitalism. Yesterday, as you know, was the anniversary of the shirtwaist factory. They call it the fire. I wanted a different word as I forwarded Heather Cox Richardson her email. If you all listeners, if you don't know Heather Cox Richardson's daily email, she's got a podcast. Her work around, it's more of a US base, but politics as well as history. So I knew some, but not a lot, how they locked the doors of the factory so that people couldn't steal piece. So if I just think about, as you said, the capitalism of work till you drop, you're only as good as your production. And folks who are working for a living wage or less than that, it really is their bodies that they're losing access to and getting sick from. I mean, I would work so much I would get sick and the flu, but I had time off. And so as an administrator, I could take time off, and but just really sensing that we're set up that 50, 60+% of the US and maybe 90% of the world work in such places that they miss days.
Yeah.
And this physically, their bodies are literally dying as they're trying to make.
Yeah. And like you, I grew up in a household that, that was very paternalistic. And so my mom bore the bulk of all of that work, the cooking, the laundry. And even though she tried to, I think I remember her when we were young, really trying to instill in my older sister, my younger brother, that there should be, I'm going to call it equality of opportunity for housework, right? Oftentimes, that fell on the girls, right? Because my brother would be outside playing. And even though we weren't sometimes asked to do his dishes because the dishes were in the sink, we then felt it was our responsibility to do that. Yeah.
As I hear you, I'm just bells around workplace. And I speak to so many women who are saying, they feel these same ways, that they get the extra unpaid emotional labor, particularly women of color, men of color too, white women, taking the notes, dishes, cleaning up, planning events, and not being compensated, and then expected to do, and then thought less of, because we're not then using our time for the more, quote, executive functions. Mm-hmm. What I wonder is might be a transition to some of the warning signs, folks that are listening across gender identity, but particularly folks with one or more marginalized. What are some of the warning signs, personal warning signs? I know I get irritable. I stop having feelings of joy. I stop wanting to do things with friends. I feel guilty if I'm not working. I feel I call it little d depressed. I think I got confronted about that one time, so let me use different language. I have felt more despair and hopelessness and overwhelmed feelings given the 2016 election here in the US, as well as George Floyd's murder, racial reckoning. So it's been, what's that, 7 years almost of high intensity of pushing back against increasing fascism in this country and authoritarianism, though I probably wasn't aware of it before. So all that to say, those are some of my warning signs. I wonder if you might share some that you know personally and or what you see in the work environments.
Yeah. So I know my personal warning signs for being burnt out is just frustration and impatience. Sometimes for me, it shows up as just a lack of joy of being in that particular space, which impacts my creativity, my desire to be collaborative, my desire to be open and even humble, right? So sometimes I'm pissed off or I get a little bit arrogant. And that for me are some of the warning signs when I'm burnt out and when I'm stressed. For others, what I notice is just a withdrawal, sometimes a silence. In a meeting or in a space. And the way in which some of that shows up is not even verbal or literal. Sometimes it's just the silence of expectation for women and women of color, right? When we're talking about responsibilities on a committee about who's going to do that service or invisible labor, the silence that occurs, and then women of color stepping in to fill that silence. And so I encourage people to pause and to reflect before taking on any committee work, especially because sometimes groupthink impacts, right? Or you feel pressured into actually volunteering in that moment. So I always encourage people to pause and say, let me think about it and I'll get back to you, and just check in to see where you are with your other work, but actually how you're actually feeling about the commitment that somebody's asking you about committee work.
When you say how you're feeling, you're asking folks to get into their body as much as they feel safe. And so it's not only just a cognitive thought. I know I think it was Dr. Margaret Beck taught me to literally imagine alternatives, like being on the committee, not being, well, what would I do with that extra 4 hours a week?
Yep. Yes.
And just feel the difference between energized, depleted, and get to know the subtle warning signs. If I go, even if I'm talking on a potential client, and I might feel my shoulder sag. I'm like, no, my body's saying, no, this isn't a good match for me and what they need.
And for those who are passionate and enjoy social justice work, this is where the danger comes in, because you're emotionally and psychologically committed to that work. But the question is, can you handle that work given all that you're doing? So it does provide the opportunity to step back and maybe do cerebral exercises. What are the pros and cons of me taking this on? Can I physically handle it? And then make the decision. Because sometimes you might be able to assist the work as a consultant, but you're not actually doing the bulk of that work.
It's a great strategy, because it could be identifying what some colleagues, Reverend Dr. Jamie Washington and others, are calling the next generation. And at my age of 66, I've been intentional following his leadership of at least 10 years of sharing resources. By the way, folks, on my website, drkathyobear.com/resources, so many resources, including my books and other things. But the intention was, I can't do it all, even though I was taught I have to, and I should if I'm going to be a good person. So really clearing out some of those old messages of, I am good enough, doing my best work. And part of that for me, as I hear you, is how can you get a couple other folks co-chairing, maybe then a couple helpers administratively, and then serve as an advisor consultant, but not have to do the hours of administrative
Yeah. And, Kathy, there's a conundrum to doing this kind of work. For those of us who are committed to social justice work, that we feel the urgency, but we do have to pause and not fall into that kind of trap, right? Neoliberal trap, white supremacist trap about fixing and eradicating racism or other forms of systemic oppression tomorrow, right? Or next year. Because if we're looking at this as a trajectory of a larger project, we know that one individual isn't going to change the system. And so we have to be mindful that we ourselves are not arrogant about how we individually can change the system in which we are working in. Yeah.
You reminded me, part of the unhealthy thoughts I have is I volunteer because if nobody does it, I'll do it. It has to be done. But more than that, it won't get done right.
Yes.
I don't know if that's the whiteness part of my arrogance. And what you're reminding us all is in community for centuries, folk of color, indigenous folks have created change, sustained communities in action through community. And I think the messages of the systems is hero, individual, leader, as opposed to supervisors, managers could pull everybody together and say, let's just breathe. And what's our passion for this work? How close are we to doing good community care, self-care? I have some handouts that could be useful to folk, and asking folks to look at their warning signs and what's working well in the organization, what's not, how can we remove barriers? But what are some of those systemic barriers that actually push people to the point of passion fatigue and burnout? So in our last couple minutes, unless you were going to go someplace else,
yep.
What are some of the signs that people start to look systemically? Because you can feel the culture if people are aware in their bodies. But more than that, what are some organizational signs that could be a clue that folks have to really invest in systemic self-care, community care, change, wellness?
So you're asking if we're looking at an organization, right, what would we see that would tell us that individuals should invest in self-care?
And or organizational change.
So for me, if I'm thinking about equity work, it is having one individual as the only individual doing equity work, right? So you're the only person in that unit or on that campus. If I'm thinking about higher education, doing that equity work. But I'd also look at actually simple things as, do they have an employee resource group? That tells you something about the culture of the organization. Are they supporting employees taking care of themselves and being in community with each other? Are there processes collective or collaborative? Is it just one individual leading change, or is it a collective of individual across multiple units representative of all employee groups, student groups, if I'm thinking about higher education, as well as upper administration? The more voices you have, the more diverse the outcome will be, for sure. So those are a couple of things. I would actually also look at, who is in positions of power in an organization. So who are making those decisions? What are the benefits look like? And I'm thinking specifically about healthcare, about salary, about work hours.
That's good.
Initially, I would look at, if I'm thinking about higher ed, the number of student groups that are supported on campus, who has voice on that campus, but also the response of the university to employees as well as the students when dissent or resistance or a cry for change happens. So there are a number of things that I would actually look for.
So many campuses and other organizations and countries are experiencing protests, cry for change. Short of protests, if leaders don't notice the whispers, it'll just increase until maybe dynamics get so big. So I'm thinking things like folks late to work, leaving early. So in addition to all you said, some of the whispers might be start to look at your survey data and go, 20% said it's hard to work here. Well, that 20%, if you lost 20% of folks in the next 3 months, and then everybody else is doing 2 or 3 jobs, and they already are, not attending meetings, not at these, especially equity inclusion, if stop coming to these task forces,
Yeah.
double scheduled. And so, oops, sorry, I can't come. And the final was just retention in general. Yes, people are blaming it on this younger generation, so some of the ageist, not recognizing that folks are finding other places to work that actually are more nurturing to them as individuals, as well as more humane work environments. And so look at systemic retention issues and that quiet quitting, which I think is a term that is okay to use. The idea, if instead of folks always raising their hand volunteering, just pulling back and doing exactly their job description because they're exhausted, don't feel valued, don't feel they belong. So there's a few others, just in a couple minutes. Anything, one more minute?
Yeah, and I do want to really encourage individuals to look at the different levels of staffing, those who need to clock in or classified staff,
Yes.
as we have at Kent State, as well as what that data shows for those who have are unclassified, they're salaried, because you would probably see the data show up a little bit different. But the point that you make about who's showing up and who's not is really important. It's such a great opportunity, right, for some leaders or managers to actually reach out and touch base with those employees, for sure. And that quiet quitting, I've just, for me, been thinking about it, the way in which people are trying to seek joy, the way in which they're kind of taking charge of their life differently, right? So the power lies with them to make those decisions about where they want to be, where they want to work, and how they want to work.
On that note, do you mind just sharing quickly your email so folks can find you, and then we'll go to break?
Oh, yes, Dr. Obear. Amoaba Gooden, AMOABAGOODEN at me.com.
Listeners, keep breathing over break. We'll come back, look at some organizational barriers as well as strategies, systemically and personal. See you on the other side. Welcome back to Center for Transformation Change Radio. I'm Dr. Kathy Obear with Dr. Amoaba Gooden, talking about organizational change to promote self-care, community care, minimize burnout and passion fatigue, and truly serve those we're here to serve and work with. And so as we think about most organizations, especially in the US, probably Canada too, but that have a Euro white centric way of being, what are some of the formal systems, informal systems that actually aggregate burnout, passion fatigue, exhaustion? And if you want to bring in national dynamics, international dynamics, because for me, they all are just like an accordion, all just playing together. So what do you see that leaders and managers could be looking at systemically to take a look at?
Yeah, so for me, it's their framework of leadership. Right? So how they see the organization and to make sure that they themselves, in terms of managers, are using a framework that's embedding equity. And so if I think about culture, for example, so what is a culture? If I was being hired, what would I look at? I'd look at the culture of organization, because looking at the culture of the organization would actually tell me about their informal and formal processes. So for example, remote work, right? Now we're all in remote work. Who's actually getting to work remotely at an organization? Oftentimes what we see are those higher salary individuals are the individuals that are getting those experiences. Certainly, especially when you think about women and women of color, right? I would again look at who is getting promoted in organizations, who's sitting in those seats of leadership. I'd look at their hiring practices. What does their job application tell me, or their executive briefs, for example, for a position, tell me about the culture of the organization? What language are they using to invite me and welcome somebody like me into the organization? Are they using words like inclusive? Are they using words like diverse? So that would actually tell me a little bit about their informal practice. The formal practice for me would be, what does their professional development opportunities look like for staff? Do they have formal, as I said, formal organizations for faculty and staff, and for students, if I'm thinking about higher ed, around community organizing, or about ERGs, employment resource centers, or student groups? I'd look at their benefits package. Is it inclusive? Are there rights for my trans brothers and sisters? I would look at that all. That would tell me about the formal structure of the organization if I'm looking at those benefits and ERGs, and about the culture if I'm looking at some of the languages that they're using. I'd actually look at their policies around discrimination, right? Title VI and Title IX, are they adequately staffed? Is there a complaint procedure and a process that would actually support me if I had issues? How are employees being evaluated? How are, executives being evaluated? Is equity, diversity, and inclusion a part of that evaluation system?
Wow. And as I hear you, I keep hearing wellness and self-care. So have you ever seen a job description that says something like, I'm brainstorming, we value the wellness and the thriving and belonging of all our employees. We value their whole person. And so we are in the process of recreating and redesigning our work environments and our policies and practices to truly create work environments that are sustainable, that individuals. So, I mean, that language, listeners, can you imagine? Just write something like that up and see if, just start talking that way, as well as put in a job description, and then build it into interviews. How do you sustain your energy over time? How do you bring joy and laughter into the work environment? How do you prioritize the self-care, community care of all those you work with and serve? Psychological safety.
And as you're talking, I'm thinking about, HR is really a great place for one to start if they want to think about the culture of the organization, because that's where those health and wellness programs, if they exist, would sit. And so I know at Kent State, that's where ours sit. So do they have employee wellness programs? And it doesn't have to be higher ed. It could be a private or public organization, but do they have, employees have access to resources both on and off campus? And are individuals encouraged to go and not just use their lunch hour or their vacation time to attend? That will tell you about the how the organization is centering health and wellness.
Ooh, employee assistance program, EAP, those sorts of things.
Yes.
You said something earlier, something about laughter and joy, and that raises the question, because I love how you keep bringing in hierarchy and classism. It's like, who can create laughter and joy? I'm imagining work environments where folks that are working at a desk, greeting people, answering the phones, if they take time off their desk, visit someone else, and have laughter, particularly if it's louder than white people are allowed to laugh or told to laugh. So, but then you could be in a meeting with people mid to upper management. We can be laughing. We can take the first 10 minutes to talk about women's basketball that UConn just lost. I'm still depressed. And that's not considered not working. And so just the disproportionate way we scrutinize and surveil folk hierarchically that are more folk of color, indigenous folks at, quote, lower levels of the organization, who can have joy and laughter.
Yeah, that's such a great point, and I think of it as leisure, right? So we are, senior executives or middle management able to have those water cooler conversations without being surveilled. But you're right, if you are a classified, 8 to 5, 9 to 5, you've got to clock in and you've got to be the front face of that unit or organization. You don't have those privileges, right? Or the leisure time at work, because you're expected to always be cheery on the phone, to always greet somebody with a smile. And if you don't, you run the risk of that becoming a part of your evaluation. You weren't smiling enough. You weren't happy enough. And I just want to, when I think about women and Black women who are often scrutinized for not smiling, not being happy, not being joyful, right? It does. And then, of course, we think about who are in those positions. We do have to call in that class and gender dynamic as well as race. We think about people of color.
As I was just rereading the book, In It for the Long Haul, it's also the name of the webinar. All this stuff is free on my website, the radio show website. I was reflecting how so many people to then and today say, I have to be on call 24/7, 365.
Yeah.
And especially given pandemic, time of racial reckoning, lots of folks coming and leaving in the workplace. The folks that are there are often training new people, plus trying to do their job or doing a job and a half or two. And I don't feel like smiling when I'm exhausted and tired. And so those dominant beliefs are, you are your work and we own you. I just got chills thinking, as a white person saying to a person of color, we own you. And just that patriarchy, if you're here to serve us, those in the hierarchy. And yet folks, senior levels, can go take a half day to go play golf with a donor or with one of their vendors, and that's considered work.
Yeah, the kind of work, right, that gets privileged. Something you said just reminded me of, in terms of what leaders could do. And I'm going to go back, and I know we've spoken about this on multiple other radio programs, is the professional development of senior leaders who have to be aware of those gendered, heterosexist, and racialized dynamic, that even when you enter the space as a marginalized individual, you already know what the script is, right? So you already know what the playbook is. And some of that is based on our assumptions, but we've seen the data that if you don't perform at this particular level, that your evaluations or your metrics are going to be off. And it's this elephant in the room a lot of times, right? And the dance that we do, because I think as marginalized individuals, we know that it will impact us eventually. And so we do overperform, right? And we do, right, work more than 40 or 60 hours a week. And we do take on that extra service and that extra workload, because we do know that sometimes it's expected of us to do that.
Demanded, and holding in all those emotions and the physical impact. I did research on people's other research of just the short and long-term impact of microaggressions and stress in the work environment. And it reads so clearly about heart disease, diabetes, early premature death. And I'm sure the data is disaggregated by class and race and gender to really show that people with more privileged identities actually have far less of those long-term physical impact.
Yes.
And so, I don't know, I just brainstorming here, but could you imagine if all leaders and managers got together with everybody that's those front-facing folks and had conversation about the expectations and how do you readjust so that people have more breaks during the day, can really be breathing, can other people cover the desk or the phone differently so that people can truly have an hour lunch like leaders do, or at least are given. So I don't know all the answers, but I wonder if you have other thoughts about the day-to-day business practices, whether it's higher ed, K-12, nonprofit, corporations, that could truly shift the culture and the climate.
Yeah. I want to add to something you said, Kathy, and then respond to your question. So I'm thinking about the impact of racial disparities, right? Heart health on Black women. Couple that with the racism that shows up in a care provider who's misdiagnosing that Black woman. So you have the stress and the racism, right? So that just, kind of puts that data right through the roof. But in terms of thinking about how to design a culture for individuals so that you are centering health and wellness. And this is where it gets really difficult for people who are staff, who have managers who might not see the value of health and wellness. And it does require some practice, right? So first of all, identifying other individuals in your unit organization that feel the same way you do, and strategizing on how to approach that manager in terms of what you're thinking. And that we know can be really difficult. We know that some managers can be open to that. They might not have thought about it themselves, or they themselves are actually in the same cycle as you are, right? And not realizing they themselves are perpetuating or reinscribing those lines of marginalization because it's also expected by their supervisor. So I would say identifying individuals in your organization who you might be able to be in conversation with, strategizing on how to approach your management. And if that doesn't work, I would actually find somebody also, if you are not in HR, in your HR unit, who might be able to create programs and initiatives to actually also help shift the culture. And for managers, again, it's that professional development opportunity to take some of those on so they can actually think about how they can actually create a particular design to actually support health and wellness. Maybe the first hour, half an hour is on emails. Here I'm thinking about myself, right? Or at the end of the day. So you're not taking some of that home with you. Encouraging individuals not to sit at their desk, to leave and go for lunch. And they're not having a working lunch. and really paying attention to your employees individually and asking them in those updates, how can I help you? What do you need? And really noticing those individuals.
So good. It's also going to take, as you said, managers and leaders modeling how they are taking care of themselves differently and saying, I notice that I'm more stressed and burned out. And so here's how didn't you kind of block off Friday afternoons for writing and research? I didn't mean to out you, but I love that. So I started doing it when you said that.
Yeah, the whole team does that.
The whole team.
Whole team does that in the division. And this is really important. Having conversations with individuals in your unit as managers, but also collective conversations really supports the diversity of thought, but that having that collective creates ideas around how people can actually care for themselves. I have one individual on my team who at every meeting is a constant reminds us all to take care of ourselves. What are you doing for joy? Why are you working at your desk? And they're amazing at doing that. I'm so thankful for them. And that's not their responsibility, but it is a reminder for us. And so what I'm noticing about my team is that they're now reminding each other to find those moments of joy, to let something pause for a moment. So
listeners, can you imagine as you start meetings, not only with breathing and rolling the shoulders, but your check-ins are joy, laughter, what's going well in your life, how are you going to take better care of yourself even this week, what can we do even better as a team around community care? Those could be warm-up activities, and share how can our meetings be not as stressful?
Yeah,
because work causes stress, but how can you break it up? How can you have more joy, laughter? Have retreats with all kinds of fun activities. I'm not saying too goofy, but activities that really are rebuilding and rekindling of folks' passion and joy. I love it.
Kathy, I want to talk for a little bit about the tension that sometimes comes from working with individuals, because that does impact our self-care, having difficult conversations, those conflicts. It's really important that we address that in really meaningful time, so as quickly as you can, because those can fester and impact not only your individual mental health and physical health, but also the other individual and other members of your team. So it's really important that people find a way to do that.
And so having the supervisor manager a brave, safe space for that coaching outside organizations, EAP, HR. But what I find out, what you hear as you do consulting around the country, Canada, other places, is those are often places where many employees do not feel safe to be, or that they're confidential. So that brings me also back to needing to change those places, but also to the manager leader training about self-care, community care in general, their own systemic barriers. Actually, all we're talking about today. And then how do we create spaces for folks to learn the skills, to have difficult conversations, to stay in it? But more than that, I mean, I've heard managers, and I agree with this, have you talked to the person? So you talk to your supervisor. People in one or two marginalized identities, it's not safe to often talk to. And I didn't get that when I was first teaching or writing about triggering events in my first book. And so to really think about how do we have supervisors and managers with an equity, diversity, inclusion lens. Okay, I'm talking to someone with far less privilege and power. The person they have trouble with, they're not engaging well with, has more privilege and power, whether it's hierarchical or group membership. Most leaders and managers are just not trained in these ways. So every time you say professional development, I'm like, yes.
Yes. Yeah. And it's so important to find that one individual in the organization that could be your coach, your sponsor, your supporter, just so that you're not feeling isolated, especially when those conflicts arise and you need to strategize around how you are going to address it. Yeah. Mm-hmm. There's one other thing, Kathy, I want to talk. Now I'm just talking a lot. So
you do it. That's why we're here.
Well, this is, as I do some of this work and as you do some of this work, what I'm so cognizant of at this moment is that oftentimes doing equity work means advancing the organization and not the individual. Mm-hmm. So we have to be so careful, and I'm very mindful of this, that even as I am working with organizations to advance equity, that we're taking care of this individual. We're taking care of the individuals in the organization, which is the self-care work. So you have to do it in tandem with each other. You can't take care of the organization and not take care of the individual.
Profit, productivity has been valued so long. People are expendable, replaceable.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, I think in these times with the revolving doors that are happening, I think some are falling back into, we just need to hire more people as opposed to invest in the people. I remember when people were retiring, when I was younger, I was grateful because that meant I could move up. When I got in my 40s, I started to go, wait, that's like 40 years of brilliance, historical knowledge, skill and strategy, mentoring, coaching. There's so much loss. And so even someone who's 25 also brings much more than in their second, third, fourth year. So how do we keep folk? That is part of. So what would you say if someone is trying to talk to their supervisor, just put one more thing on their desk and they're done? I mean, they are overworking. How would you coach them to engage that supervisor before they take on something else? Because that, I think, is the date, that hits the rubber hit the road.
Yeah. So it depends on how pissed off they are when that piece of paper lands on their desk, right? So if you're pissed, you might not want to say anything in that moment. Might want to take a breath. You might want to say, thank you. Can I come see you in a minute? Whatever words you could muster to let the individual know that you want to have another conversation about it. And, practice. The best leaders, the best individuals who are confronting or are going to step into a conversation that's difficult, they practice what they're going to say. So again, I would lean on a friend, a colleague, a coach, a sponsor. Just practice how you're going to talk to that staff member. And what I would appreciate is, I really want to do this, but I can't. I'm strapped. I'm overwhelmed. I have nothing else to give. And as a supervisor, I would actually understand that. I'd actually even understand, I just can't. I don't have it in me. You don't even have to apologize. You don't even have to say that you think the work is valuable. You just say, I can't. I don't have the bandwidth, the capacity to take this anymore. This is where, for the supervisor having professional development opportunity, they would have been in tune with their employee, would have understand that 5 or 6 major projects or 2 major projects might just be enough for that employee at this moment of time, and maybe this additional work needs to pause. Or they might want to say, well, what else can I take off your plate so that you can get this done? Because it's really important that the division gets this done in a minute. Right? So being in conversation with your staff member is so important. Asking if they can do it is so important.
I just can't tell them to do it. You're reminding me about how important it is 3-4 times a year, at least, not only individually, but as the whole team, to say, so let's map out all the things everybody's doing.
Yep.
And let's see how the context has changed. So does that mean our priorities need to shift? And let's all collectively understand, as opposed to just the supervisor has to be kind of spinning plates with each individual person, collectively, because we may find that actually someone says, actually, what I'm doing actually isn't as high anymore. And this one I'm more interested in. And teaching people collaborative decision-making, as you said earlier.
Yes.
Are there ways people can have more influence on what their days and lives look like?
Exactly. Because we all have work that we enjoy. I mean, there's some that we don't, but we all should be doing, there should be a portion of the work that we're doing on a day-to-day basis that's bringing us some kind of joy.
Wouldn't that be fascinating to have everyone, what refills you, what is depleting, what brings you joy, what aligns with your passion, what aligns with your life mission, your core values, and ask people to have that self-reflection and then bring that. That would be a phenomenal team retreat. And then have people say, so how could we do some of the work we have on our plate with more joy, refilling? We could keep talking about this for hours. I want to remind folks that the book In It for the Long Haul is free on my website. It's free on the radio show. There's also a webinar. There's worksheets. And this book and many other books these days are talking about individual burnout. I hope that this conversation really helped broaden my mind. Thank you, Amoaba, about what are the systemic changes we need to do, how we supervise, hire, coach, and we could have kept talking, but these are the questions to be asking systemically. As we just have a few more minutes, what else would you like to share, or advice for leaders, or how you take care of yourself? Or
I have a dynamic team, and my leadership style is really a testament to the team. It's really important that leaders, especially when thinking about systemic change, are in conversation with a team that they're working with, because your work around self-care can't happen individually. It has to be a collective effort. So I just want to offer that at this moment in time. Check in with your team members regularly and often. It's really important you have a sense of who they are, and support them when they want to exit your unit or an organization. That's also about taking care of them. Be their sponsor, be their coach, be a good reference for them, because not only are you taking care of their current selves, you're also taking care of their future selves, both professionally and personally.
And they may be a contact for you in the future. They may send people to you if you need to have a self-interest in this.
Yes.
The message of, if I leave, I'm a quitter, is so much a part of white supremacy culture. And sometimes the best thing as we close this out is to say, I've done my best. And this climate is one that is actually not the best fit for me. I'm not thriving, I'm not belonging, and I'm actually burning candles at 5, 6, 7 ends to be here to serve those I passionately. So this is enough. And you don't have to tell anybody you're looking for another job. You can actually go interview, you can apply and realize, whoo, folks think I'm more competent than my current organization does. And you can use that to leverage change in your current organization if you want. Or you can take the leap to say, you know what? The universe is aligning that I am supposed to be somewhere else, because I'm supposed to be of service someplace else and useful, and maybe learn there too. And the last moment, final thoughts, Dr. Gooden, and please let people know how to find you.
Amoaba Gooden at me.com, AMOABA GOODEN at me.com. My final thoughts are just to take care of yourselves. Whether it's yoga or walking or dancing, just find your joy, whatever that is. Reading, find your joy. It's so important that we center that as we're advancing change.
Everybody take a deep breath. How do you start your day? With tea, with people you love? How do you end your day? With tea, people you love, who support you, and in between.
Yeah, being in community is so important. Laughing, being silly, so important.
I have so valued you in my life, Amoaba, the tea we drink together here and other places. And thank you so much for sharing wisdom, just your personal insights, who you are, your brilliance.
Thank you so much to be in conversation with you, Dr. Obear.
I'm Kathy Obear, Center for Transformation Change, wishing you all deep healing and deep social change. Go well.
Bye.
You've been listening to Dr. Kathy Obear on Transformation Talk Radio. Thanks for tuning in, and be sure to catch us next time as Kathy inspires listeners to become agents of change, motivate, innovate, and speak truth to power. Step into the courageous you that will change the world. Connect to life-changing conversations to extend your reach. For more information on Kathy and her work, please visit drkathyobear.com. That's drkathyobear.com.